Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice. So first of all, thank you so much for taking your time. We short period of time we manage this podcast. I really appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
And so how was your day today?
It's good.
Uh-huh.
Busy like most days.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really glad that the weather's getting warmer.
Yeah. And we now recent meet, and I know you
Mm.
for quite some time, and it is really hard for me to articulate your introduction. Like kind of calculate. You have a lot of diverse background,
Mm-hmm.
and you have did really good on those things.
Mm-hmm.
And you have like decade of experience on such things. So it will be easier for me and my for the audience if you could give your short introductions and like how would you like people to know you.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm from the United States, from
Yeah.
Buffalo, New York, which
Mm-hmm.
is small city outside of New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I started coming to Nepal in 2008
Yeah.
because at the time I was in graduate school
Mm-hmm.
and I was studying to become a translator.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came to Nepal first to study Tibetan language.
Mm-hmm.
Um, During that time, I came more than one time. So each time I came back, I kind of met new people and became friends with new people and
Mm-hmm.
just kind of kept coming back. So that's how I first came to Nepal.
Mm-hmm.
Also, during that time, I was working in the fire department in Buffalo area.
Mm-hmm.
And then I switched from fire department to police department about 11 or 12 years ago from now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of how I got into the tech field. So I went to graduate school I went to law school. So I
Law
have a
school.
law degree.
Uh-huh.
And I was actually studying law in different parts of Asia. So in
Uh-huh.
particular, Western China, Tibet. So the reason I actually came to Nepal related to that
Mhm.
is I was looking to translate a Tibetan law code that was written in the mid 1600s.
Tibetan law code which is written in mid 60s.
Mid 1600s.
1600.
So like 400 some years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was the last law code written by the government of the Dalai Lama.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to translate it, but
Nice.
I needed to learn much more complex Tibetan to do that.
Uh-huh.
So that was how I came here. And then, like I said, I just kept coming back. And, after that, when I got involved in law enforcement, I got much more involved in technology, especially technology-related crime.
Mm-hmm.
And so over the course of that career, I trained with many different places. I trained at the Secret Service's Computer Forensic Academy.
Mm-hmm.
I learned video analysis at the FBI's technology training division. And then in November of 22, I retired from law enforcement,
Mm-hmm.
from government altogether. And after a few months, then I came back to Nepal. So now I'm in Nepal teaching technology, cybersecurity, and ethical hacking at
Mhm.
Softwarica College.
That's pretty much sum up what you do.
That's the summary, yeah.
Yeah, that's somewhere, and we will get in depth like what make you choose those roads.
Mhm.
So tell me about your like early stage of life. What was the days back in your childhood, like, and back in the days, what were the technology that you were using, and how that affected you?
When I was very young,
Mm-hmm.
the closest thing to technology that I thought was really cool was Nintendo.
Nintendo.
Nintendo, the
Yeah.
video game system.
Yeah.
Um, Other than that, I didn't really do much in the way of technology. I didn't own my first cell phone till I was like 25.
25.
Yeah, and it was the old flip phones.
Yeah.
Um, but I always had kind of an interest in tech.
Mm-hmm.
So, I got my first like home computer around the same time, like between 22 and 25 or so.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I just learned a lot about how it worked out of a hobby, not
Mm-hmm.
like a job or anything. But yeah, any kind of like advanced tech beyond just some of the basic stuff, I really didn't do that much
Mhm.
until like my later 20s. One thing that I was really interested in was technology related to the vehicle.
Vehicles.
Yeah, so I had this big van when I was like 19,
Yeah.
and inside I wanted to learn how to put lights in it and
Yeah.
the radio, the music system and all that stuff.
Mhm.
So I learned a lot about that part of technology, but of course back then it wasn't connected to the internet. It wasn't.
So what did you study in your like high school? Like, is there any subject related to the technology? back then?
Not really. No, I mean we had what they called a technology class back then,
Mm-hmm.
but the closest thing, the only sort of I guess relevant thing that I could say that we did was we learned to use like the earlier version of like GIS mapping
Mm-hmm.
programs and that. I don't even remember what they called it back then, but it was nothing like it is now.
So you bought your first computer when you were 25, right?
Yeah, around there.
Around there. So how much that cost you back
Oof.
then?
Back then. I don't know, but I'm quite sure it was probably cheaper than my phone is now,
Yeah.
because back then they didn't do much. I mean,
Yeah.
if you had 1 megabyte of RAM, it was probably like an advanced computer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even sure what the first make or model of computer that I actually had.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in school, it was the Apple IIe. That was the big thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't remember what the first Windows machine was. I'm sure it was probably Windows 95
Mm-hmm.
or somewhere around that. But
So
yeah.
what your teacher are teaching on your school, like with the computer that they have?
In those days,
Yeah.
we really still didn't use computers much.
For the showcase or for the publicity they have installed in the schools?
Not really, no. I mean, in most schools, it was at that time it was still pretty lucky
Yeah.
for schools to have like computers that they regularly used.
Mm-hmm.
So in most cases, like I said, we had like, an Apple IIe or a Texas Instruments like Commander or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
But those were more like special things. It wasn't something you used
Mm-hmm.
regularly, and they didn't use it to teach. It was just sort of there,
Just to be there,
just to
For-
kind of
for-
say we have
yeah.
this cool new computer,
Things.
even though they were this big.
So, like, I would like to ask you, like, what were the ambitions back then when you were in your high school, Like, of all those friends around there, there was, like, in the Asian parent thing, there is, like, doctor, engineer, pilot kind of thing.
Mhm.
So, what was back of your mind? Like, what do you want to be?
So at that age, I wanted to be a professional sports player,
Yeah.
or I wanted to travel. So
Yeah.
I didn't really, have like a particular thing I wanted to do. In fact, when I first left high school,
Uh-huh.
when I would have been like 17,
Mm-hmm.
I did go to 1 year of college, and I just took a whole bunch of different things
Uh-huh.
because I had no idea what I wanted to study.
Yeah.
And even after that, I didn't go back to the second year.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, me and several friends decided to like travel around the country, and the U.S. is a big country, so we
Yeah.
drove around and visited a bunch of places. But I had no idea at that point what I was gonna do.
So, like, during those travel period, like, how do you manage the fund and like things?
Yeah, so we traveled with there were 4 or 5 of us.
Uh-huh.
So we had saved up a bunch of money to go,
Mhm.
and then we just kind of managed things as we went. Like we would either try to be really careful about what we spent,
Mm-hmm.
or if we could like pick up some short work to
Yeah.
make some money, we would do it that way. So
Mhm.
it wasn't a great plan.
It was just full of energy, and you want to head towards somewhere.
That was it. Yeah, it was just
Yeah.
like, let's all go do this thing,
Yeah,
and we'll
yeah.
see what happens.
Let's do it, like 4 or 5 friends, bunch of things that
Exactly.
happens. So, like, what really bring you to buying your first computer to the tech? Like, what has drawn you there?
So when I bought my first computer, the new cool thing
Mm-hmm.
was the chat room.
Yeah, chat.
So back then it was like AOL,
Yeah.
right? So it was the first sort of version of like public scale social media.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was like a big part of it. Part of it was also I was very interested in how they work,
Mm-hmm.
but part of it was a way to connect with people that you didn't know.
Yeah,
You
and
know.
it is exciting.
It was exciting. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a new thing, and you know, it wasn't filled with all the crazy people and all the stuff you have now. You know,
Uh-huh.
it was mostly just other curious people.
Yeah, trying to
Um,
connect with the internet.
yeah, yeah. And I
Uh-huh.
actually still to this day am friends with a couple people I connected with through
Yeah.
that all those years ago, you know.
Uh-huh.
So that was a big part of the motivation.
So that make you like think how does this is working kind of thing?
Um, a little bit, yeah. I mean, I was always just curious about stuff in general. So like
Mhm.
you've seen my website, I'm all over the place, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I was curious about things in general, and then around that time, I actually got my first sort of technical job working
Mhm.
in like an IT place as like
Mhm.
a first level customer support.
Mhm.
Um, so you know, it was actually a pretty decent paying job compared to what I was used to at the time.
Mhm.
So that was also a bit of a motivation to learn more
Yeah.
because I could see that there was like money in that field, you
Yeah.
know.
Less work, a good paying skill, you know.
Yeah, because before that I had mostly worked in restaurants. So I
Mhm.
had cooked in a
Mhm.
number of restaurants. And believe it or not, when I was that age, I liked that job, but they
Mhm.
didn't pay that well. So this like
A
tech,
new
tech
job.
support job was like
Yeah.
all of a sudden paying like quite a bit more.
So you start the technology journey, right? And let us start from your first job. Like, what was the first job that you did?
So the only actual tech job that I did, I worked for a company that had some kind of like online internet system. I can't remember exactly what it did,
Mm-hmm.
but basically like the customers would call in when it didn't work. And
Yeah.
then we had this like checklist of things.
Click on your computer. On my
Yeah, you
computer.
turn it off, turn it back on, you know. It was pretty basic, you know,
Yeah.
but of course back then most of the things were. So we just had like this sort of checklist that we went through,
Mhm.
and then if that didn't work we would like escalate it up to some engineer person. But that's the only actual tech job that I had for a long time after that.
Mhm.
So after that I did other things.
So, how did you make like plan to study the law? What was
Kind,
the story behind it?
kind of the same way I planned everything else. So when I went to college,
Uh-huh.
I didn't go to college. I went for 1 year after high school, and then I
Mhm.
went again. I didn't go back
Mhm.
until about 5 or so years later.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went back, I still didn't know exactly what I wanted to study.
Mm-hmm.
I had this idea in mind that I wanted to be like an archaeologist,
Mm-hmm.
you know, go to like ancient ruins and dig in the dirt.
Yeah.
You know?
Find out history.
Yeah, yeah. But it wasn't exactly realistic. So when I first went back to college and I stayed, the
Mhm.
first thing I wanted to do was learn another language. So I studied Chinese.
Yeah.
So I took
So what motivated you to choose like study other language?
just because I felt that it was going to be really important in the world in general, and
Mhm.
also for searching for a job, and
Mhm.
especially because I didn't know the type of job.
Mm-hmm.
You know, China is basically like the second biggest business market other than the US.
Mm-hmm.
So I figured even if I didn't know what exact job I wanted to do, being able to speak the language would be a big help once I figured out what job I wanted to do.
That was
Um,
quite a smart move, you know.
Yeah, I mean that was a very practical decision, but
Uh-huh.
also I just found I found the language itself interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was very different than learning like you know in American schools they mostly teach like German, French, or
Mm-hmm.
Italian or something, or some other language, European languages.
Mhm.
So I was like, oh, this is different, you know. So I studied that, and then so when I was doing my undergraduate degree, so my undergraduate degree is actually technically in Asian Studies was
Mhm.
the name of the degree. But I started finding that I really enjoyed taking like the history classes. So when I was getting near to the end of my undergraduate,
Mhm.
my original plan was to go into history as an academic, you know, like a PhD program.
Mhm.
And I got accepted into a PhD program. So my first year of grad school was toward a history PhD with a focus in like Western China and Central Asia, like you know Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan. So the first year I was in that program, they were because I got accepted right into the PhD program, not the master's program, they wanted you to start thinking about like your research plan like right away. And so I wanted to do something kind of related to law because I just always found it interesting. So I was looking at these Tibetan law codes because there was a professor at UB who had done some work on law in Tibet like many hundreds of years ago, and I thought, oh, that might be cool, you know. And so when I started working on that project, that's first how I came to Nepal because I needed a place to study the language, you know, from native speakers, and there's a large Tibetan population here. So I went to China 1 year, and then I came here 1 year to do that. And then my one professor that I was working with related to the law codes made me aware of this program at my university where if you're doing a law degree and another degree at the same time, they'll fund all kinds of things like your research, your tuition, all that stuff. So I enrolled in law school. So then I was doing law school and the PhD at the same time. And I did win that fund. So they funded me for 4 years, which was enough to finish law school, finish my master's, because even though I was in the PhD program, if you do a master's thesis, you can get the master's degree. So I did those two things. And so my plan was never to be a lawyer, but I wanted to go to law school to learn the law from a formal education because I was studying the law, but from a historical standpoint. So that's how I ended up in law school.
That sounds really awesome, you know, like traveling.
It's really something.
Yeah, but like, how did you manage to do such all of this stuff? You know, you are studying law, Tibetan language, and you are like preparing the research paper as well. So how hard it was to manage all those, and it is in the different language that you know, it is not, you know, familiar language to you.
So it was really hard actually because I was working. So I was in the fire department at that point. And I was also, my first child was born right when I was still in undergraduate school. So I used to work overnight. So I used to work at night from like 10 at night until like 6 in the morning. And, you know, that kind of job, like, you're either really busy or you have nothing going on. So when we had nothing going on, I studied and I did all my work. And then I had class during the day, and then I would come home in the evening and do family things. So so basically for like 3 years, I slept like 2 hours a day. And just the rest of the time was like study and work. So so I don't recommend going that way for the young people. Like, don't have a kid, you know? Don't get a full-time job, and then go to school full-time all at the same time.
And doing multiple studies, you know?
Yeah.
On the same time.
But, I mean, I just, I put myself in that position, and so then I just had to figure out a way to manage it, so I did. And that's actually when I started drinking coffee. I never drank coffee before that.
You need that, you know, because the system is not working that way, you know?
Yeah. I honestly, I didn't, if I had maybe a sip or two, but I never drank coffee as a regular coffee drinker until I was in that situation.
Yeah, you need to stay all night, you have to do the things.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so it was just, you know, it was just taking one project at a time and getting it done, and then moving to the next thing and moving to the next thing, and whenever I could take breaks or sleep, then that's what you did, you know. So yeah, but it was a long couple years. So
that would be, you know, in the now if you remember those days, it would be kind of a pleasing moment, but back in then those hassle, you know, where things are like you are grinding every single day, but you know nothing is showing on the surface. That could be pretty hard, you know.
Well, the one thing that helped me survive is there was a coffee shop. So my university campus was really nice. I really liked my campus. And there was a coffee shop at the one end, which was near a lake. And they sold these chocolate chip cookies that were about this big for like 25 cents, which was really cheap. And because it's all sugar, you know, it's all junk food basically. I would get my coffee and that cookie, and then that would like make me good to go for another like 12 to 15 hours. So that was how I and the place was really nice. So I'd hit my coffee and my cookie, and I could sit and study right by the lake.
Uh-huh.
So that was like the thing that kept me going and kept me going through. So it was good.
Nice.
But I really actually, believe it or not, even though it was difficult, I really, really enjoyed my college years at that university.
Yeah.
So,
Because you chose the things you really like enjoy, you know, or
Mhm.
that really excite you
yeah,
in a way.
yeah. I mean, there was a lot of difficulties, but you're
Mhm.
right. It was the work. I really liked
Yeah.
what I was working on, and my primary academic advisor was a really fantastic man.
Mhm.
Just absolute like genius guy, and just knew everything about the subject.
Uh-huh.
Um, so he was really, really cool to work with, and even to this day, I've fallen out of touch with my advisor somewhat. He's probably in his 80s now.
Mhm.
But the one teacher that I learned Tibetan language from, who was an American guy who had studied it, he also was a lawyer once, so that was
Mhm.
kind of funny how that worked out.
Yeah.
But he and I are friends to this day, and that's going back like 20 years. So, but yeah, it was a really great time, but a
Mhm.
really challenging time.
At the same time. So, how did you get into the fire
So
force?
yeah, so I was when my first child was born,
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was really important to learn like basic like first aid,
Mm-hmm.
things like that in case
Mhm.
anything ever happened. So I joined the volunteer fire department
Mm-hmm.
in my neighborhood, and then through that, somebody that I knew there connected me with a paid job.
Mm-hmm.
So I was working the paid job. So that's how I got involved in it. But then I just really loved it. So I was, I just kind of pursued it and continued, and it ended up being like a lot of fun,
Mhm.
So
I think you love adventure but at the same time, you know.
yeah. I mean, there was definitely that, and it's its own community, sort of like how we have the tech
Uh-huh.
community and this, that, and the other thing. So you meet and you get to know a lot of people,
With
and
a lot of history, like I have like been part of that thing. We solved that, you know.
yeah. So, and you do some pretty remarkable things, and those people that are there with you when you do it, it
Mhm.
just kind of creates like a certain bond,
Yeah.
So, but it's tough. It's tough on the body, you know.
Yeah, it is very like risky as well, you know.
It can be, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it's like any other thing that the risk is mitigated by the training and
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, the amount of effort you put into preparing ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were very, very strict about a lot of that. So so I never really felt like it was all that risky so much as
Mm-hmm.
it was just a difficult job that you had to follow sort of a plan to be able to
Mm-hmm.
accomplish.
So, like you started that fire force thing, you know, like for the sake of like learning things, you know, first aid, do things, and then you get into the position where you manage all these people, you know, like motivate them and like prepare them and really solve the problem on your community and on the whole, you know.
hmm
So, how did that leap happen to you? Like,
Well, I don't think that was as much a leap as it was just an evolution of
yeah.
things. So
Mm-hmm.
like I was always any job that that I had, I always took whatever trainings I could get, figured
Mm-hmm.
out what other ways I could learn new stuff,
Mm-hmm.
advance like that. So and that was basically the same thing. Like, you know, whenever there was trainings and new
Mm-hmm.
skills, new things, new tactics, new whatever it was, I would take them as often as I can. And like anywhere, at any kind of job, you have people that do all that stuff, and then you have the people at the other end who do very little of it, and then everybody else is kind of in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So the people that tend to do all that stuff or most of that stuff usually end up becoming sort of the leaders because they're just around more and they're learning more skills and they know more things. So it was just kind
Mm-hmm.
of like that.
So from those things, you know, you are not really into tech till now, you know. You are
Mm.
into other things. You are learning the language, learning the law, and you are into history, you know,
Mm.
you studying the Tibetan law. And so how does tech come to in your life, you know, as a part of you learn things?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I wouldn't say, you know, even some of the stuff we were doing in the fire department wasn't, or did involve a fair amount of tech. You know, so like there was a movement for a while to figure out how to enhance like our overall communication, like with other departments and things. So we talked about like, you know, having like sort of smart panels inside our vehicles, and so tech wasn't completely devoid. It just wasn't the main focus, you know. But then even in studies, like so when I was in law school, you know, I was very interested in how tech was being used in like unlawful ways. So when I was in law school, the big thing in the U.S. was the drone program, the unmanned aerial vehicles that they were using for military activity in other countries. So I was very interested in the law part of that, but learning the law part of it required learning about the technology. So I was never fully not involved in tech. It just wasn't always like the front focus, right? It was like related to something else I was doing. So so as far as like the full scale shift where technology became the primary thing happened after I joined the Attorney General's office, which was my law enforcement career. And even then it was a phased approach, because when I first went over, more of what I did was related to like financial crime. But all crime, you know, became a technology issue at some point, you know. So so in the beginning, it was just like we would have this thing we wanted to do and we didn't have the technology to do it. So I would figure out some way to
connect with the technology,
to employ some technology to do it, you know. And then over time it became like, we just don't have enough of this. How can we get more? And then that led to like new trainings, and then that led to new equipment. So it kind of just like in steps like grew, you know, until eventually it was like this, right?
Yeah.
So, which is kind of seems like how most of my careers go.
That's nice.
Yeah.
And like what was the selection process of that eternity? It was
For which thing?
yeah, for like you join the eternity, you know.
Yeah, so I don't remember exactly what their process was, but I know that when I went to the interview, Nepal was a very big factor in how I got hired, I think. So one of the people that was interviewing when I went for the very first time had actually just come back from Nepal for a holiday. He came here. He just wanted to see Nepal, right? And I had been here the summer before that. So this was, you know, the interview was probably like in October. He had come here in September, and I was here from like May to like August or something. So when we got into the interview, you know, we're doing the normal business interview type thing, and somehow it came up. I don't remember who brought it up or how it came into the conversation, but I was like, oh yeah, you know, I've been going there for many years and this, that, and the other thing. And he was like, I was just there. And then the rest of the interview was like, we talked a lot more about that than other stuff. And then next thing I knew, I got hired like, you know, a few weeks later. So I'm not saying that's the only reason, but it definitely
like
created a rapport between us. Yeah. So that was kind of pretty funny how that worked out, actually.
Nice.
Yeah.
And I would like to talk about that logo that you are carrying in your t-shirt. Like, what is it?
So this is my nonprofit.
Uh-huh.
So my nonprofit is based in the U.S., but what we do is we do a lot of research and development in using technology toward helping with natural disasters. So our primary project, or our big project, is we have an application that can ingest all different kinds of data sources, from satellite, remote weather stations, crowdsourcing, volunteers that provide different data, to create early alert or early warnings for people in places that are potentially facing a disaster. So like, you know, if you have a flood that starts up high in the mountains in a river, we know where that flood's going to go eventually, because it's going to go where the river goes, you know. So we can issue a warning, and we can give like a timeline based on the changes that we see. With like a wildfire, for example, we can look, you know, our system will calculate the sort of probable direction the wildfire is going to go based on weather data, wind data, those sorts of things. And eventually we're hoping, the science isn't quite there yet, but eventually we're hoping to also be able to sort of provide like alerts for areas that are at higher risk of like landslides, for example. So that's our main project, and we're looking to deploy it in many places, but we started in Nepal because Nepal's has a lot of those disaster type issues, and a lot of Nepal is quite remote, so it's all, you know, it's quite difficult to sometimes get the information to the people. So that's one of the things we do. We also work together with other NGOs and other agencies to coordinate. So like right now we're in the process of getting several NGOs that focus on response. So for example, you have a flood, people are, you know, displaced from their homes. They need somewhere else to live, they need some supplies. So we're working with those NGOs as well, so that when we know like an incident is likely to happen based on our predictive software, we can also alert them with information. Be ready. There's this many communities in the path, you know, potentially this many people, so that they can start preparing to collect their, you know, response resources, whatever they are, right? Medicine, clothes, food, whatever it is. So that's one of the things that we're doing. And then also the other main part of it is we're looking to be able to create or incorporate with an already existing database that collects the data itself. So like in many communities, and in Nepal as well, there's a lot of thought about what kinds of things can we do to mitigate the damage that's going to happen. We know floods are going to happen. We can't help that, right? We know landslides are going to happen. What kinds of planning can we do ahead of time to reduce the damage, whether it's injury or death to people or just economic damage, the types of things we can do with that. So the amount of data that we collect can be used toward that kind of planning and research. And so we're trying to coordinate where that data is like shared with the people, the entities, the organizations that could use it, how we can share that in more or less like real time instead of it being sort of like this library they have to go to and like, you know, search for it. So that's the main thing. And then we do, you know, some other things like we work with a couple NGOs to do like first aid training, you know, basic fire suppression training. I wrote a guide back in 2015 after the Gorkha earthquake. I wrote a guide for places where they have multiple people, like schools, hotels, any place where like several people might be there when an incident happens, how to do like an emergency plan so that you can respond to it in an organized way when it happens, but you can plan ahead of time so that, you know, if you have, for example, if you have a college and you have, you know, an earthquake, what do you do right at that moment, right? What does the college staff do? How do they know where the students are? Where do they have the students go? What happens when the earthquake stops and you maybe have damage? So we have a whole manual based on how to prepare and how to handle those situations.
And I think like being experienced, I have experienced like 2 of the earthquake, and those earthquake, like the first one was really of a surprise, and the second was on our school, and we really don't know what to do, and our teacher also was puzzled like what is happening, you know. So that kind of unpreparedness, unawareness, like create, like we have studied it quite a while, you know. Like there is something called earth, like earth set, so we didn't get it until we experience, you know. Like
well,
what
and that's the case in many places, right? You know, it's like that was the biggest earthquake here in like 80 years or something. So people weren't thinking about it, you know. That's
we have an experience of what could be happening, you know.
And that's you know, that's what happens. So so that's why we created this manual. It's like it's really simple, but it's a kind of an organized outline, and we wrote it in English, Nepali, and Tibetan, because back then I was working with some of the monasteries because I was doing the translation stuff. So I wrote it in Tibetan as well for the Tibetan monasteries, because there's quite a few large Tibetan schools also.
There is.
But it was really interesting because translating some language related to disasters into languages that really haven't thought about them too much was really difficult. So like, we talked about like if you had some kind of like toxic, like chemical spill, because like in the U.S. there was just not too long ago there was a big train derailment, and so you have this poisonous gas like pouring into the atmosphere, and that's still a problem that people have to figure out what to do with. So we wrote a response to that as well in this manual. But trying to translate that into like Tibetan was really challenging. Like, how do I describe a radioactive, disasters?
So how is your experience? In till now you have stayed so long in the Nepal. You come frequently visit the Nepal, and you interact with the Nepali youth, being a lecturer in this events as well. So how do you feel about the country?
I think it's like many others in that you have a whole mix of different attitudes and different ways of doing things. The one thing that I would say that seems to be common among Nepali students is there's this sort of seeming fear to assert themselves, So like, for example, so I taught a careers class last semester. It was all about like different skills and strategies toward getting a job in technology field, right? And so I brought my fiance from the U.S. who used to own a theater and dance studio. And so she came in and, in the U.S. she used to teach her students, like, how do you perform in front of 1,000 people? How do you sing
handle
and dance?
Those eyes,
Yeah, the eyes, the personality, everything, right?
Yeah.
So she came in and I had her teach my class. And so she would stand up there and she would just pick somebody and say, you have to do this. And it was really like uncomfortable for them.
Very scared of.
Yeah. But it turned out that it was really a good experience, because I think Nepali students tend to be accustomed to never having to do that, right? Never having to sort of put themselves into the spotlight in some way. But the problem is, when you're trying to get a job, you're up against however many people, right? Tens of thousands of people maybe, when you're competing for a job. And so one of the keys is, how do you stand out in a good way?
Of the crowd.
Yeah. I mean, like a friend of mine back in the U.S., he's a business executive guy, and he tells me, like, they might get, 500 to 2,000 resumes for one job.
Yeah.
And so the resume is one step, of course, but like even then they still might interview 100 people.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
So how do you in a good way? You don't want to do it in a bad way. You don't want to show up and have like purple hair and drinking a beer in the middle of the interview. But how do you stand out in a good way that they remember you? So when they're making that decision,
they likes you,
Yeah, they have to like you. They have to appreciate your skill, those sorts of things. So I think that for many Nepali students, that's the bigger challenge than many other things. Because like from a skill perspective, I don't see that as any issue whatsoever. I mean, Softwarica, because I know that place, has had students that have won international competitions in capture the flag, hackathons, all those types of things. It's there's no skill issue. The education that they get here, at least in the tech field, and I can also say in the hospitality field, because I know that field quite well as well, the ability that they come out with from education is as good as anywhere. So that's not the issue. The primary issue is an American student is maybe less afraid generally to try to take charge of an interview and just say, look, this is why I'm that good, blah, 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 Whereas Nepali students seem to be more reluctant to do that. So it's not a criticism, it's just that's an observation, And so like when I teach classes or workshops or just give these kinds of talks, I try to encourage or offer ideas for, how can you like manage that sort of thing. And, of course, part of it, too, is there's always, like, language barrier, cultural barrier. If you're interviewing at a place where the interviewer is from, like, the UK or US, you don't know exactly. The interaction is awkward, right? You don't know exactly how to handle it. But there's still strategies that you can take to try to bolster your confidence
Yeah.
and put forth your best skills and your best features, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's also why, like, you know, I think that many educational institutions would benefit their students more by also trying to offer some
Soft skill training.
training on
Mhm.
that, you know, outside. Many colleges have like career classes and things like
Mhm.
that, but I think it's useful to bring in people from a diverse
Background, you know.
background, industry,
Mm-hmm.
um, because there's just nobody that can be that good at that as an individual. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's the sort of combination of experience. So like I said, when I brought Tammy in to teach that class, you know,
Mm-hmm.
many of the students really remembered a lot of what she taught because it was
Yeah.
quite different than what they were accustomed to, you know. And that was only one class. Like
Mhm.
I was being lazy and I said, here, you teach this class today. So, but I actually knew that she
Uh-huh.
could help with that, you know. So, but as far as like the rest of Nepal, you know, I hate the traffic.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, no, it's you know, it has all the good and the bad of any other big place. So speaking of Kathmandu, at least,
Mhm.
you know, of any big place, there's a ton of cool restaurants. The
Mhm.
number of coffee shops in Kathmandu has grown like insanely. You know,
Mhm.
you know, I had a meeting earlier today about because I'm giving a talk at one of the TEDx things coming up,
Mhm.
and so I met with the organizers just to discuss like sort of what the platform is and what the rules are and that sort of
Mhm.
thing. And you know, we went to this coffee shop that I had just been to like once or twice before. That's nowhere near anything. It just
Mhm.
happened to be where I was near then, and the place was fantastic. You know, and there's so many of those that are just like really really good. Like even
Mhm.
around the area where I'm staying right now, you know, 10 years ago that was like rolling farm hills. And now I can walk like 200 meters and I can get a fantastic piece of cheesecake,
Uh-huh.
you know? So in that sense, like, you know, the city is really improved. There's like a lot of really cool things, you know, that have come about.
Mhm.
But then with that comes the bad stuff, like so much traffic, you know,
Yeah.
the pollution because of the traffic
Mhm.
and because, you know, it's very confined space. So, I mean, I think it's, you know, I think it's like at any other big city other than every place has like their own little sort of things that are pretty cool
Yeah.
and some things that are not so cool,
Mhm.
you know? So, but I mean, if I didn't like it, I wouldn't still be here, right?
Yeah.
So,
That's nice.
yeah.
And like, so if I am a student, you know,
Hmm.
like from your perspective, so how much the degree, you know, is important to me as a like ethical hacker or in the field of cybersecurity to land me a job or like for future career.
So, in the computer industry, it's a little bit different than other fields
Mm-hmm.
in a few senses. So, for example, um, no hospital is going to hire you as a medical doctor if you don't have a doctorate degree,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's an MD or maybe a PhD, but it's just not going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
The computer industry doesn't have that sort of strictness. Like
Mm-hmm.
you can go and get a very high-paying, good computer job based on skill alone. And many young people, I think that's the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that, though, is it goes back to that first thing I said: is when I'm an employer
Mm-hmm.
and I'm hiring for a job, and I have 1,000 resumes on my desk,
Mm-hmm.
the chances are that the person without any sort of credential is not going to get much attention, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the degree comes in part because you just want to at least get that initial notice, and if you don't have that to put on there, that can be really challenging.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as well, and I would say also that getting the degree is really important because you can be really good at some industry or skill. But the problem is it's really hard to be organized and to be sort of on top of what the most important thing is in that field and that
Mhm.
without some direction. So like going to college, for example, is really helpful to steer you in the path to
Mhm.
how to get good at something, right? When you learn it on your own, you don't know what's important or what's not. So you just kind of do stuff, you know, and maybe you get it right, maybe you don't. But your chances are, I think, smaller than if you go to a college where you're learning from people that already know the field.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I think getting a degree is really important. Now, that being said, there's other ways to be able to move forward in this field.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, one of them, of course, is working just from the ground up. If you already are quite talented at something,
Mm-hmm.
and you can get a place to even take you maybe as like a free intern for a while to show your stuff,
Yeah.
that could certainly work for some people. The other thing I recommend, especially in the computing field, whether it's cybersecurity, programming, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
is getting the external certifications.
Yeah.
You know, so like they have certified hackers, they have certified forensic, you know, all those different things.
Mm-hmm.
Because those show that that you have the motivation to go out and do your own program.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the second thing is many of those are quite difficult to get, so it shows that you have skill and sort of the, you know, tenacity to keep working at it. Yeah, keep going. But the other thing too is they're usually pretty specific. Most of those certifications are in a pretty specific category,
Mm-hmm.
so it shows that you're really good in that category. So I think certifications are a really good way to go. It's just that they're challenging to get, and some of them are quite expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But if a student does, let's say they have their bachelor's and they go get a job somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just working there for a little while, if they can manage the funds and the time to do the certification,
Mm-hmm.
it could be nothing but really helpful, I think.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the other thing, which I always sort of repeatedly tell the students, you know, and especially, again, going back to that sort of shyness factor,
Mm-hmm.
is you got to network.
Yeah.
You have to go out and meet people. I encourage even my students who are still like in their undergrad
Mm-hmm.
to make a business card
Yeah.
and just say, student interested in cybersecurity or whatever the case is, and go to all these events that you can find.
Mm-hmm.
Like a week ago, where we've talked, you know, I was
Yeah.
at the AI boot camp, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're here now in part because of that, right?
Yeah.
But those kinds of events, you know, whenever you can get to them, whether they're free or whether you have to pay something or whatever, however you can get to them,
Mm-hmm.
is such a critical thing because it goes back to being able to stand out from the crowd, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So if I meet you in person,
Yeah.
even if we talk for 5 minutes, and even if you hand me a card that just says you're a student,
Mm-hmm.
and then later on I get some resumes because I'm hiring somebody,
Mm-hmm.
and I see your name, there's a really good chance that it's going to come together.
Yeah.
And I might be like, you know what, I talked to that guy already and he's cool,
Mm-hmm.
so I'll give him a shot, you know.
Yeah.
Or just sometimes you just run into somebody who's just like, I just need someone, and you're there,
Mm-hmm.
so we'll give you a try.
Yeah.
Or I don't need anybody, but I know someone who does. You know, like that's a huge way to get connected.
Mm-hmm.
And also just to be around people who have already managed some level of success so that you can sort of follow their path in some way,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or at least get some guidance.
Yeah. They can recommend us to a different position if they found one.
Yeah. I mean, there's any number of things that could happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the chances of you discovering those things on your own, I just think are much less
Yeah.
than if you could get out there and connect with other people in the business, you know, whatever your business is. Doesn't
Mm-hmm.
even, not even necessarily computers, you know, it could be, like I said, hospitality. It could be, you know, if you're into like psychology or whatever, you know.
Mhm.
I think networking is a really, really key point, and all young people tend to not think about it too much,
Yeah.
you know. So, because if you start early, by the time you graduate, you might already have that job lined up,
Mm-hmm.
and you're miles ahead of the other students, you know.
Yeah, that could be perfect, you know.
Yeah.
So, like, when you start your journey, you know, into cybersecurity, like, have you read some of the books, you know? You must have found some of the books really useful. So, would you like to recommend some?
Meaning, like books as in, what do you mean?
Related to cybersecurity.
Yeah, so I actually read quite a bit. There was a while back where I don't remember the exact place, but there was, you know, I had just been searching around the internet to find
Mhm.
free stuff to read, and they had this package where they had like 10 PDF books for like $1 or something.
Mhm.
I bought that, The thing I recommend more than that, though, because the books are great, the problem is it takes quite a long time to write a book, go through the publishing process, and then publish it, right? And in the cyber world, a long time is, like this, and then you're in a whole new universe, a whole new epoch, So what I really recommend is, rather than worrying about too much, I mean, obviously you need books for your courses and things, but for like someone's own self-study, though, it's really important, I think, to find people who write on or produce videos on the field of the topic that they're interested in, and follow those, because those tend to be much more quicker turnover that they come out. Like on my website, I post something every 3 days. Now it's not all tech, but I can put stuff out because I'm the researcher, I'm the writer, I'm the editor. So once I think it's good enough, I can just put it out. I don't have to get a review process or anything. There's some really good YouTube channels that you can watch and learn stuff, and many of those will also link to reading material. So those kinds of things I think are more useful because it's a bit more flexible. They stay a bit more real time, so they're a bit more up to date. But the other thing that I also suggest, and I always invite people on my own site, is they should also try to produce some of their own stuff. Right? I understand videos can be a little bit more challenging. I actually even dabbled in making my own videos, and it's difficult. It's time consuming, it's resource heavy. So I like to write, but when it goes back to we're talking about like standing out from the crowd, having a few pieces published somewhere, even if it's just on somebody else's website or a blog site or something, it points a potential employer to things that you've done, that you can sort of show off what you know or your skills. So I really think that that's really important. Like, I actually have a student from Softwarica right now who's co-writing a piece with me that we'll put out probably another week or two.
Nice.
I've written with faculty from there. I've written with a couple students from there, and then I've written on different topics from people all over the place. I think that that's a really useful way for students to sort of practice their own skills a little bit, because there's a saying that if you can't explain something to a kid, then you don't know it well enough yourself, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So writing actually helps you figure that out, because you have to like kind of organize your thoughts and put them down, and then it has to make sense. When we talk, we can just kind of sputter out anything, and it doesn't always make sense. So I think that's a really useful thing. And then, like I said, it's also really good because, when you apply to these jobs and stuff, like some places ask you, like, give us links to stuff about you, your websites, whatever, and believe it or not, I think a lot of hiring managers actually look at those quite a bit, because if someone has the sort of motivation and the sort of just mental attitude to put those things together, those are the types of things that like employers are looking for, So I think many hiring managers, when they see a link, like, LinkedIn, maybe not, but like if they have a link where like, here's some writing of mine, there's a very good chance that probably many of them will go look at it. So I think that's a really, really useful and important thing to do.
Putting the piece of yourself in the internet on your work. That's really interesting to see as well, as a person, like how you grow from like writing something stupid to something really useful, to something that you really enjoy,
and something that can be really informative or helpful to other people as well, So and like the people that write with me, they get pretty good exposure. I mean, I have readers from every continent except Antarctica, and we usually get a few thousand a week. So, that's for someone that's trying to find their place in the world of their industry, that kind of exposure is really great,
Nice. And like, what motivated you to open like the evidence file, the YouTube channel?
My website and channel?
Yeah.
So, if you haven't been able to tell, I kind of switch topics a lot. Both in my career and in what I write. I find that one way to stay mentally flexible and good in the things, even the things that are important, like your job field,
Mm-hmm.
is to constantly sort of challenge yourself and your brain
Mm-hmm.
and your work ethic as well, right? So when I first started writing my columns, I had no idea what I was doing. It was just something to do, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a way to exercise all these sort of things I wanted to explore.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the beginning, I actually didn't even know what I was going to write about. I just picked random stuff, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then that sort of developed into, it helped me develop into the things that I really actually enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of do it for two purposes. One is partly for education, because I know I read and watch a lot of stuff that nobody ever does.
Yeah.
You know, but some of it's pretty interesting. People just don't know about it, and other people maybe don't want to take the time to go looking for it because they
Mhm.
have other things going on. They would love to read about it or know about it, but they don't go look for it, you know?
Yeah.
So that was sort of part of it. And then part of it also is my own exploration into things. You know, I like to know more about things that I find interesting, or I like to, if I know I don't know something that well,
Yeah.
that's one way for me to learn it. Is if I'm going to write about it, I have to sort of figure it
Research
out.
is, understand yourself.
Yeah. So, and you know, it's also just a good exercise in venting, right? Like
Mhm.
just releasing some energy, some thoughts. You know,
Mhm.
I stay away from like, you know, mean, nasty stuff for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, every once in a while, that's a good way to
Express yourself as well,
yeah, you know, like if you know, a political thing is making you mad, or like some
Mhm.
company thing, you know, if you do it eloquently, then you can
Mm-hmm.
vent off that anger about stuff in a still informative way. You
Mhm.
know, so for me, it kind of serves like a bunch of different purposes that way.
That's nice. And what about the YouTube channel?
Yeah, so the only thing that kind of goes on there regularly is the podcast that I do. I tried videos and stuff. They're just so much work, and it's really it's really time consuming and
Yeah,
difficult.
I just saw your old videos, what you are trying to do and what really happened. I can feel that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's usually happen, like
Mhm.
when you start something. And I think many of your video are only state as well, private.
Yeah, I toyed with it, but it's just too much work, and for the
Yeah.
time and the resources that I have, it just really doesn't.
Makes sense right now.
Yeah, so I just I'm just putting the podcast up there,
Mm-hmm.
and because that's done like in a studio setting, so I don't have to do any of the.
You have to just come and explore the things out,
Yeah. So that's really nice, and I
Uh-huh.
only do that once a month because it's hard to shoot regularly.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sure you probably know. It's
Yeah.
it's not so much difficult to get guests. It's difficult to get guests in there at the same time I can get in there.
Yeah.
So I just post one a month, and then this way it's not like super stressful to
Mm-hmm.
get. But usually, it kind of goes nicely with also what I write as well. So like in my one podcast episode, I had a musician from here,
Yeah.
and I just happened to write an article about his sort of cultural background without knowing about him specifically,
Mhm.
So it's kind of cool how that like came together.
Mm-hmm.
But for the podcast, it's just like anything else. It's like whatever I can find that's interesting. I don't really
Mhm.
focus on a particular target, So, but I try to treat it all as like an education platform, like somewhere to learn
That's
stuff.
really nice. And over this podcast, from the very beginning, I noticed something about you. Like you are really like passionate about things,
Mm.
and you explore it, and you treat every medium as if they are like teaching you.
Mm.
You are finding a better way of learning it.
Yeah.
Whether it's teaching other people, whether it is like watching other people or being involved in it,
Yeah.
that's really cool,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's how it stays interesting, right?
Mhm.
Like, one thing that I see a lot, at least in the U.S. in particular,
Mm-hmm.
is people get, a job or whatever. Maybe it's a good paying job,
Mm-hmm.
and then it just gets kind of stale. Like
Mhm.
it's just the same thing. Like, yeah, I make good money, but there's an expression like everybody's working for the weekend.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Right?
Yeah.
And I just find that to be too boring. I can't live that way.
Working 5 days for only 2 days.
Yeah. And just to have like a nice thing that you can only look at in the evening because the rest of the time you're in the working place,
Yeah.
So like I just didn't, I can't follow that approach. Like
Mm-hmm.
that to me is just boring, you know. So I would rather, even if it's harder, because sometimes it is, explore things like from both my own learning perspective and a curiosity perspective, and sort of just keep doing things that way. So plus, I mean, you know, I think it just benefits everybody instead of just me. You know, if we're always doing something for ourselves, that's fine. If it's, you know, not hurting somebody else, but it doesn't bring a lot to everything else. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think, especially in this day with the technology and the internet and all these things, we're already being conditioned to shelter ourselves
Yeah.
from everybody else. You know, like it's considered, like, I guess, common social interaction to just interact with people like by a text message or on a Facebook or whatever, you know.
You're staying in the room,
Yeah.
like talking to a lot of people.
Yeah. But you're not really talking to people. You're just
Being a
communicating.
social
Yeah.
without being a social, you know?
Yeah,
It's like-
yeah. I mean, you're being social with a device. It just
Yeah.
happens theoretically that there's somebody at the other end of that device, you know.
So we find our phone to be on the hand every time.
Yeah.
I think maximum of our time.
And so even when people are in person, you see that, right? You'll be in a place and there'll be 4 people at a table eating dinner and nobody's looking at each other,
Yeah.
you know? So, and that just to me is like, I don't know, I just don't find that interesting. You know, I would much rather have a more sort of vibrant and colorful interaction, in whatever way that ends up. So,
Nice. And you wrote an article 1 year ago about like Nepal being a tech hub, you know?
yeah.
So I would like to know more of it, you know, from your perspective.
Yeah. So the argument that I made in that article is that Nepal now has many of the same features that Bangalore in India had in the 80s. Right? You know, the economic climate was not exactly the same, but the economic climate was similar. The sort of development progress was similar. And sort of the global climate in some ways was similar, right? And so basically what I argued is that if you look at some of those similarities, and that if Nepal is able to profit from them the same way that Bangalore did, there really is a good chance that you could make Nepal a major tech hub. I mean, if you look at India, India is basically second only to like probably Silicon Valley, right? In my view, Silicon Valley is a dying thing. You know, there's too much money, not enough innovation, not enough development, a lot of corruption, you know, and Bangalore is starting to suffer from some of those things as well. You know, job growth has gone down, job salaries have stagnated. You know, they're not growing like they used to be. They also have some corruption issues, some development issues. You know, so if in Nepal, because, you know, there's some things that there's an advantage, like the economic condition here enables companies to work cheaper, to do the same work for the same pay, right? There's a good infrastructure here technologically, right? You can get good internet, you can get good cell service.
Yeah.
There's data hubs and things that you can work from, you know. You have a very large available workforce, you know.
Yeah.
I know a lot of, you know, young people leave by the huge numbers every year. But if you capture even a percentage of that, those are all potential workers that you have, you know, and then they don't have to leave, especially if you can pay them well.
Yeah.
And then, of course, with the wages as they are now, Nepal can be much more competitive than even India, because you can still pay workers well here, but still be cheaper than what it costs companies to operate in, like Bangalore, for example.
Yeah.
You know, so that's where I was saying that I think Nepal's in a good position to do that, but there's certain things that also need to be done to succeed at that, you know. So I'm not going to get into politics too much, you know, but there's like law issues and things like that. You know, some of those things need to be sort of situated to make it more attractive to outside business to bring business here, right? But if those things happen, I think that I think it could very much be the next technological boomtown. You know,
Mm.
you have, like I said before, you have the skill, you have a lot of those other things in place. It's just sort of getting over the finish line.
Yeah.
You know.
So at last, I would like to talk about the like topic of the town, the AI thing. You know.
The elephant in the room.
Yeah, that is, and it is like disrupting every field,
Mhm.
and every professional is like looking to it.
Yeah.
You know, rather than those techies kind of people. But the whole world is like now betting on the AI.
Mhm.
And the recent Devin
Mhm.
and like a artificial software engineer
Mhm.
and a thing that is like creating some kind of chaos in the market. And
Mhm.
every person I know, like who is like starting in their software engineering journey, to a person who is really equipped and is doing for years,
Mhm.
are really panic about it. You know,
Mhm.
they are sharing memes. That sounds funny for right now, but it is really serious issue. You know,
Mhm.
if a company can like replace those people with
Mhm.
single people could, so many of the people will lost the job.
Yeah.
And we have seen in the global market the tech recession that we are facing. So what is your view on that?
Well, so when I think about that, I like to think about it in terms of blockchain.
Blockchain,
So remember when blockchain was the big thing, right?
Web
Cryptocurrency
3,
came out,
yeah.
and there was all this talk about how blockchain technology was going to revolutionize everything, right?
It will replace money, not people. Yeah.
Well, they were saying people at some point too, because they were saying we could use this to, you know,
To
enhance
document,
efficiency,
yeah,
and
efficiency,
all these things.
yeah.
And what happened?
It is like getting into its place, settling down.
It's
yeah.
around a little bit, right? You don't
Yeah.
hear much about it though,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the one difference with AI is that a lot of companies have already adopted it and replaced employees with it, right?
Mhm.
And if you look at the companies that have done that, it has not gone all that well.
Yeah.
So I just read yesterday that there was a company, I won't name them because I don't want them to sue me or you,
Mhm.
but it's an insurance company in the US.
Uh-huh.
And they were using AI to make determinations on whether someone qualified for some medical coverage,
Mhm.
you know, based on some procedure or medicine or whatever. And it was giving a 90% denial rate,
Oh.
meaning 9 in every 10 people that wanted some kind of medicine, some kind of medical procedure, weren't getting insurance to cover it
Mhm.
because the AI was making this
Mhm.
decision, right? So, and then you're seeing other companies that are using this and they're having many of the same problems.
Yeah.
So what I think is likely to happen is that in the short term, you're going to see all that chaos because
Mhm.
companies are just seeing like we can save money, right?
Mhm.
And then they're going to pay for it when it fails, right?
Mhm.
Because the technology isn't perfected yet.
Mhm.
And the question is really whether it can be perfected to the point that it can truly like replace people.
Mhm.
And my suspicion on that is that that is not something that can be done anytime soon.
Yeah.
Now, it's not to say that AI is not a good thing or can do really incredible things,
Mhm.
but the problem is that there's such a rush to adopt it that there's not been enough care into making sure that it does what it needs to do.
Mhm.
You know, so if you take like ChatGPT, which is probably the most famous AI among people, right?
Mhm.
You know, they have not resolved the same problems that have come out from the first version of it. You know,
Yeah.
it still hallucinates. It still provides totally wrong things.
Yes,
It can
yeah.
be completely manipulated based on the prompt. You know, and that's a multi-billion-dollar company that hasn't been able to figure it out. Right?
Yeah.
If you take AI in self-driving cars,
Mhm.
that's been primarily a failure. You know,
Yeah.
Tesla still doesn't have a self-driving car, even though they've been talking about it for like a decade,
Mhm.
right? The few that are out there, so they have this taxi service in the U.S. that's running on self-driving cars,
Mhm.
and you read like every day about these ridiculous stories, because the problem that they haven't gotten over is that AI doesn't really think in the sense that people think it does,
Yeah.
right? So like, if you're walking down the street,
Mhm.
it doesn't matter if you've ever encountered some situation that happens in front of you, you're able to respond to it in some way,
Yeah.
some appropriate way. and we don't entirely know exactly how people are able to do that, right?
Mhm.
It's just humans just aren't able to do that. Animals, whatever, all that. AI doesn't have that capability,
Yeah.
at least not in the same way, you know. So it needs to do a lot more development, but I think it will be rather chaotic for a while because companies are trying to use it anyway,
Yeah.
despite the problems. So when students or people ask me like, what do I do to prevent like AI from taking my job?
Mhm.
It's hard to say. I don't know the answer to that because it's not really AI that's taking your job. It's the companies that are taking your job and giving
Yeah.
it to something else, right? And whether they act on a rational basis or not, we can't predict. We don't know,
Mhm.
you know. So it is a period of uncertainty right
Mhm.
now, you know. So the only thing I can really tell people is just be as good at your job as you can be,
Mhm.
and you know, if that happens, then it happens. You have to sort of deal with it. But you know, if you're truly good at what you do, there's a pretty good chance that AI actually can't replace you
Mhm.
completely. You know, but it's an area that's in a certain level of flux. You know, and we don't know where that's going to go just yet.
Mhm.
But I mean, the other way to look at it though too is if AI could replace
Mhm.
tens of millions of jobs, that all sounds frightening and all well and good for companies to save money,
Yeah.
but AI doesn't get paid and it doesn't
Mhm.
go out and spend money in the economy.
Yeah.
So something will have to come from that
Yeah.
anyway, right? You know, so like a good example is, you know, when the first motor vehicle assembly line
Mhm.
was put together in the U.S. under Henry Ford, right?
Mhm.
You know, all these people that made their living in horses and carriages and all those things were like, you know, terrified. Like, what do we do? Nobody's going to be using these anymore. But the reality is, usually what happens is the new thing creates a whole bunch of other opportunities, you know.
Yeah.
And sometimes the transition is not comfortable. It's not smooth.
Mhm.
But the transition always happens. You
Yeah.
know? So I don't think it would be much different here.
Mhm.
And if it is entirely different, we would have to rethink the whole economic system because you can't just put 100 million people out of work
Yeah.
because then you have no one contributing in the economy, right? Like that doesn't work either.
Yeah.
So it will right itself somehow.
Mhm.
How it does that is a little difficult to see yet.
Yeah.
For people who are interested in the field, though,
Mhm.
I would say definitely go study it. There's so much room
Mhm.
for development, research, innovation, you know, in AI as a field.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really great field to go into,
Mhm.
especially now. You know, and at this point it's kind of cool because you can go into it and not really know where you want to go
Yeah.
because nobody knows where the field's going.
Yeah.
You know?
That's the thing, you know.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it's a really big opportunity for the people that want to study it, but
Mhm.
And potentially work in it. But yeah, I mean it's gonna be chaotic for a while.
Yeah. That's truly. It is like we can see in the market like what is happening. So in the end, like I would like you to share some of your learning lessons till now, हुन्छ नि?
Hmm.
Like I just speaking in Nepali, like did you understand that?
Yeah. So anything particular or?
Yeah, हुन्छ नि भनेको. You didn't get it, right?
No,
It just came in natural to me, okay?
Yeah.
So what are the lessons that you like to share with the young audience, you know?
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's a couple of main factors to being successful, right?
Mhm.
So the first one is you have to be curious
Yeah.
and eager, right? There's always going to be the person that somebody knows that lucks their way into some great job,
Yeah.
who's like doesn't really do anything, you know. That's going to happen. But you can't judge like yourself on that.
Yeah.
So for yourself, you know, you have to be someone who wants to learn, who wants to try different things, who's
Mhm.
willing to do things that maybe are not totally in their comfort zone. Like I mentioned networking before, a lot of people
Mhm.
don't like to do that. But you have to be willing to do at least some of those things, and really sort of focus on trying to do like at least one thing at a time, but each, one after the other. The second thing that I would say is that you don't have to necessarily know what it is you want to end up doing.
Yeah.
I mean, over the last hour we've been talking, obviously I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Right? This job, that job, this career, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Right? What matters is just that you find a way to proceed towards some success, whatever that is for you. And I would say really think hard about like what success actually means, right? So many people, what is always the focus, right? I want to make this much money. I know a lot of people that make a lot of money and they're pretty miserable. So that's not the key to success in a happiness sense, right? And again, you may not know what that is. So the best thing you can do is just try to build the foundation to get there when the opportunity comes.
Yeah.
Right? One thing that I've always been good at is I've always sort of created like the chance for opportunities to come my way, because you never know when that's going to be. And so a lot of it's luck, you don't know when you're just going to meet that right person or whatever. So you try to position yourself to be there. But then the last thing I would say is don't look outside for happiness, right? So, and I mean that in a couple different ways. So one thing is I hear it from virtually every Nepali student I meet. I want to go here. I want to go there outside Nepal, right? And I encourage that. I think people should go out and see the wider world or whatever. But doing that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go and just be instantly happy because now you're living in New York or you're living in Sydney, Australia, or London, right? It's the grass is greener thing, right? Like everybody thinks it's nicer over there until you get there, and then there's really everywhere has its own problems, right?
Yeah.
But it also relates to inside versus outside yourself, right? I forget exactly how the quote goes, but it was something like, when your problems are inside, doesn't matter where you go outside, they're still with you, right?
That's so true.
So like if I'm miserable, if I'm a 20-year-old Nepali guy in Nepal and I'm miserable, if my misery is because of my own internal workings,
conflict,
it doesn't matter if I move to New York, I still have that internal conflict, right? So it really requires sort of analyzing inside what are the things that makes me unhappy and be kind of honest about it, like why do I feel like I'm not succeeding? Why do I feel like I'm unhappy or angry in this place or whatever, and if you can analyze those from a objective perspective, a lot of times you'll find that many of those things are kind of easily solvable. It's just that we never pay close attention to them because we always think that there's this outside thing that we can do because that's the easier thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like let's say that I can't get a girlfriend, right? Maybe it's because I'm just a jerk.
Yeah.
Right? But if I don't look inside at myself, I'm always going to be blaming
all the people, situation, things.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And it never changes. But it's a lot harder to look inside and say, man, I'm just a jerk. Like I need to change my attitude, right?
Yeah.
And so if people can do that, especially at a young age, it's so much easier to get through life and be happy and just find the things you want to do. So that's my advice. And, I had that jerk moment as well. So I could speak from some experience, like look inside and go, you need to change the way you act a little bit,
Yeah.
So that would be my advice to people.
That is really nice. I really appreciate your time, like coming here and sharing those useful insight. I really enjoy the podcast.
Yeah, me too.
And
this is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for you to come here. And thank you so much.
Yeah,
for coming.
no problem. Thanks for having me.